Okay, we're going to get started. Good morning and good afternoon to everybody on the call, depending on where you're located across Canada. I'm really happy to have all of you joining today and welcome to the Quest National Distributed Energy Resources webinar today. And hope everyone's having a good morning or afternoon on this crisp winter day in February. I'll just introduce myself. My name is Eric Muller, and I'm the Director of Stakeholder Relations at Quest. And I'm also the lead for 3 of our working groups. We run 9 different working groups across Canada. And the 3 that I'm facilitating and managing are one focused on community energy planning, another focused on distributed energy resources, which is this webinar that we're hosting today, and we'll be doing a number of other sessions throughout the year. And another working group that I facilitate that's focused on district energy. So if any of you are interested in any of these working groups or any of our other Quest working groups, feel free to reach out to me at any time. I'll just take a look at the participant list here. It looks like we've got a large number of participants, which I'm really pleased about. And just to remind everyone that I've got everyone on mute just to keep the line nice and clear for our presenter. And so it's great to see strong participation from across all of Canada in this webinar. So I can already see from the registrants and the participants as I look through folks from different sectors. So from government, and I see utilities, municipal folks, the finance sector, education, development and construction, and I also see some from energy efficiency organizations as well. So if you're just joining, I see a lot of people are just joining in the last minute or so. I'd like to welcome you to today's National Distributed Energy Resources webinar, and I'm happy to have you here and welcome to you. And as I said, happy to see great multi-sectoral interest from across Canada. So for anyone new to Quest, I'll just give a quick 1-minute overview about Quest before we get into our feature presentation. So as you can see, I'm sharing my screen here, and I'll just jump through a couple of the Quest website tabs to give you a flavor of the various types of work that we do. So, but first of all, we're a national non-governmental organization that's really focused on our vision of Canada being a nation of smart energy communities. And so we really try to accelerate those smart energy communities. And when we say that, that's efficient and integrated community scale energy systems. And so we run a number of different kind of initiatives and activities. And before I get into those, I'll just point out that we have subscribers that support Quest and that participate in a lot of our activities. So you can see here our plus level subscribers from various sectors, and then our full list of all of our subscribers. We do projects, we run research projects, and so a couple of our latest ones include the Smart Energy Communities benchmark, which I would highly encourage all of you to take a look at. It's an excellent tool for municipalities and communities to kind of score themselves and see how they're doing in their progression to becoming a smart energy community. And furthermore, if I can get my tabs here, there we are. We run, as I mentioned, 9 different working groups across Canada. And I would encourage you to take a look through our various working groups, some focused on different technologies, others focused on municipalities and community energy planning. And you can take a look through all of our different working groups on our website. And finally, we also provide advisory services. And you can see here, we specialize in running various types of workshops on energy mapping, on resilience planning, as well as around community energy planning and other custom services. So that's a quick overview for all of you who may be new to Quest, just to give you a flavor of the breadth of activities that we're involved in. And so normally what I would do at this point is kind of go through roundtable introductions, but because we're kind of doing a different flavor of a meeting today, you know, a webinar format, and because of the large number of participants, we're going to skip the roundtable introductions just to keep things moving along and allow more time for Victor's presentation and more time for questions and answers around it. So I'm already seeing a little bit of activity on the chat, so that's great to see, and I'll just let you all know as the presentation is happening, you can certainly input your questions or comments into the chat, but I think we'll get to them at the end of the presentation, so you can enter them in as they come to mind, but we won't necessarily stop unless Victor chooses to take some questions and answers throughout. And then also at the end, we'll open up the lines and everyone can choose to unmute yourselves if you'd like to ask some verbal questions and make some comments as well. So with that, I'm really excited and really pleased to introduce Victor Gallardo. And Victor, what I'll do as I'm introducing you is I'll stop sharing my screen and I'll ask you, and I see you got your video on so everyone can see you as well. I'll ask you to share yours as I introduce you. So Victor is an economist at the Canadian Energy Research Institute, and he co-authored the CERI primer on distributed connected generation in Canada. So he's going to be providing us a really good cross-jurisdictional overview of the landscape across Canada. And so without further ado, I'll turn it over to Victor.
Thanks, Eric, and good morning, everyone. I'm really excited to be here presenting on this topic. You know, I'm obviously biased because this is my research, but I believe that we're going to see a lot of changes going forward in the way we think about electricity, you know, especially because it is the first time that consumers are given the opportunity to become producers. You know, that wasn't in any of my economics books, so it's a new problem to solve. Anyway, so thank you for listening to what I had to say, and let me just start by talking about a little bit about CERI and what we do. So CERI was founded in 1975. It is an independent registered charitable organization specializing in the analysis of energy economics and related environmental policy issues in the energy production, transportation, and consumption sectors. Our mission is to provide relevant, independent, and objective economic research of energy and environmental issues to benefit business, government, academia, and the public. And just a little bit to mention about our core funders. We get funding from the Alberta government, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, and Natural Resources Canada. So just to jump ahead on with the agenda, I just want to go through what I want to touch on today. So first, I am going to define distributed connected generation as it is broadly used for environmental policy purposes. Then I'm going to give you a quick overview of the institutions and the regulatory structure supporting the electricity system in each province. And then from west to east, I'll present a provincial breakdown on the policies that have been put in place to promote distributed generation, but I also touch on the results and the official figures that are available. Lastly, we will open the space for a quick discussion or any questions that you may have. Now, I ran this presentation through my wife yesterday, and she recommended that you know, even though I'm just touching on the surface, it is 10 provinces, so it's a lot of material. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to go through the first provinces first, and then take a little pause and maybe let all the concepts sink in. And maybe if you have any questions, just open the space for maybe 2 or 3 questions just to clarify some concepts, and then we move to the next provinces. So with that, just to set the stage, the distributed connected generation, as it is commonly used for energy policies, has to meet certain criteria. So it has to be an electricity supply source producing at a low voltage levels. This can vary depending on the jurisdiction, but in general, the voltage has to be low enough that can bypass a transmission system and can connect directly into the distribution system. And in terms of the capacity, the limit also varies depending on the jurisdiction, but in general, these systems produce anywhere between 1 kilowatt and 15 megawatts. Now, just to put things in perspective, an average size needed to supply enough electricity for a detached home in Canada is between 5 and 10 kilowatts. But so say a backup generator for an airport is about 4 and 5 megawatts. Now, the second point is that these generating systems have to be located near or at the point of consumption. The electricity generation that from these systems has to be used to meet all or at least part of the electricity needs for residential customers, small businesses, or small communities. And lastly, these generation systems make use of technologies that rely on locally extracted primary energy resources, which is wind, solar, hydro, biomass, or geothermal. So that gives them an attribute of being environmentally friendly. Now, there are some exceptions to this definition, but I'll highlight these distinctions when we get there. So now in terms of the institutional framework, and this is common across all provinces, there is usually one ministry responsible for setting the policy and the legislative framework for the overall provincial electricity system. And then there is one quasi-judicial regulatory body or agency in charge of regulating the rates that utilities are allowed to charge to customers. Then you will find the utility companies that can be crown corporations and or private companies. It doesn't have to be either or. Some provinces have both. And now, depending on the level of the regulation, there can also be other agencies that oversee the operation of the market. And those agencies also take an active role in the long-term planning of the grid. Now, if you guys really want to know all the names of all the institutions in all the provinces, I added an appendix at the end of the presentation for your reference. So with that, let's dive into the first province here. So it's going to be BC. So in 2004, BC Hydro, which is the main utility in the province, introduced the net metering program, which allows customers to install systems with a generating capacity less than 50 kilowatts. The limit was eventually increased to 100 kilowatts in 2008, and this program allows customers to sell excess generation back into the grid. Then in 2008, BC Hydro introduced the Standing Offer Program, which opened the door for larger generating systems with a capacity between 100 kilowatts and 15 megawatts. Customers in this program were compensated through electricity purchase agreements or EPAs. And now in 2014, the micro SOP program was launched. This program was targeting First Nations communities, and the program included systems between 100 kilowatts and 1 megawatt. One of the conditions to participate in this program was that the First Nations community needed to keep ownership of at least 50% of the generating system. And these participants were also compensated through EPAs, or like electricity purchase agreement. Now, in terms of the results, as of 2019, it was reported that more than 1,800 customers were participating in the net metering program, with a total installed capacity of 13 megawatts. Most of these customers were using solar photovoltaic systems. And as of 2018, there were about 170 megawatts under contracts through both the SOP and the micro SOP programs. The initial target was 100 megawatts. Now, this is where things get a little interesting, because when you see an initial target of 100 megawatts and you reach almost double that target, in general, you would consider that to be a success. However, both programs, the SOP and the micro SOP, have been canceled over concerns around electricity rate increases. And in terms of the net metering program, BC Hydro just submitted an application to the British Columbia Utilities Commission to limit the size of the generating systems that customers are allowed to install in their homes, because they are witnessing a new trend where customers are installing systems that are exceeding their electricity demands and are receiving significant annual payouts, which it will be paid by the rest of the ratepayers. Now, moving on to Alberta. In 2008, the government introduced the microgeneration regulation, which opened the door to all Albertans to be able to produce electricity for their own consumption. Initially, the regulation included systems with a maximum generating capacity of 1 megawatt, but amendments done to the regulation in 2016 increased the maximum capacity to 5 megawatts. Customers subscribe under this macro generation regulation get compensated through a net billing mechanism. Then in 2016, the NDP government introduced the Renewable Electricity Act, which mandates that 30% of the electricity in the province had to come from renewable sources by 2030. Now, in terms of the results, as of February 2020, there were more than 5,000 sites registered under the microgeneration regulation, with a total installed capacity in the province of about 68 megawatts, and 94 or 95% of that of these customers are choosing PV systems. Now, also the current government right now has not made any decision regarding repealing or retaining the Renewable Electricity Act or the microgeneration regulations. So there is really no clear direction as to the government's position towards distributed generation. And now in Saskatchewan, in 2007, SaskPower, which is the Akron Corporation and the main utility in the province, launched the Small Power Producer Program, which allows customers to produce up to 100 kilowatts for their own consumption. In 2018, the government introduced the Power Generation Partner Program, which allows independent power producers to install generating systems of up to 1 megawatt if they come from renewable sources, and up to 5 megawatts if they produce electricity from flare gas and waste heat. Now, this is a good example of how some governments and provinces don't adhere to the definition that I gave you at the beginning, and expand the scope to include non-renewable sources in their programs. Given the reality in the province in Saskatchewan and the activity in oil and gas, the government considers that this policy is a good alternative to having natural gas just going to waste. Lastly, in 2018, they introduced a net metering program, which replaced the Small Power Producer program. Now, the results of these policies, so the first round of the net metering program received an overwhelming response and reached its target 2 years in advance. Now, this is not official information, so don't quote me on this one, but I read in a couple of places that the cap was actually reached in less than 2 months. This program had to be canceled temporarily, and it was reintroduced in 2019. But in this second round, the government is offering less generous rates for subscribers. And the Power Generating Partner Program has resulted in 20 megawatts of capacity from waste heat generation. The program has a cap of 10 megawatts of new added capacity per year from renewable sources and 25 megawatts per year from flare gas and waste heat recovery technologies. SaskPower has announced that it is prepared to add between 70 and 105 megawatts of installed capacity within the next 3 years. So there is really no intentions to cut these programs. So with that, I just want to make a little pause and make sure that we are all understanding the concepts. And if you have 1 or 2 questions, maybe I can address those questions right now.
Sure, thanks, Victor. This is Eric at Quest. I'm going to open it up to anyone who wants to enter a question into the chat box, or you could also unmute yourself. You have that capability in the Zoom program to unmute yourself, and you can chime in with any verbal questions. So we'll just pause for a minute and see if there are any questions verbally or in the chat box. Okay, I'm seeing one in the chat. I'll just read it exactly as it's written. Great speech, comma, who do you see the Canada's DER policy? I'm not sure exactly what the question means, but Victor, or how do you see Canada's DER policy? It's a broad question, but Victor, if you want to try to take that, go for it.
Absolutely, no problem. So I think that the challenge is that every province is responsible for their own grid. So we are not as connected as some markets in the US. So when you're looking at the policies for DER across the country, you basically have to look at the policies independently by province. And so right now, I think that we are at early stages, and we, because it's such a new technology, I think that Ontario is trying really hard to accommodate their policies and regulations to allow for the introduction of more or the increase of these systems. But in general, I think that right now we're such in an early stage that you know, some governments are afraid of opening the door too fast. You know, as in case of Saskatchewan or BC, that you know, you have all this electricity flowing in the different direction, and then you also have a lot of people on the hook for paying for the fixed cost. So I think that that right now there's probably not a national policy, but it is fragmented by province, and then you will have to look at the situation by province to understand how advanced or how open they are for these systems. I hope this answers the question.
Thanks, Victor. That's great. And just to add to it, as Victor was alluding, and I know Ontario's market pretty well, and the Ontario Energy Board, as well as the Independent Electricity System Operator, are both progressing in consultations and regulatory proceedings around how to connect and how to treat distributed energy resources in the future market. And I know Alberta is also grappling with that in the distribution system inquiry. So there's a lot of kind of policy and regulatory activities happening right now, grappling with that question. Are there any other questions either that you want to enter into the chat box, or anyone on the line would like to unmute themselves with any other questions before we move on? We'll just wait 15, 20 seconds in case anything else comes in. Okay, we've got another one. Do you think that renewable natural gas in water and wastewater facilities, as well as waste management facilities, will be more employed?
Oh man, I think that depending on the local situation and the local, like you know, again, like there will be some regions where you have all these waste available, and then you have the technology available that it will make sense to use it. But just you know, trying to build those technologies in places where you don't even have those resources is probably going to be more costly, right? So it is probably going to be more a function of the resources that you have available at hand.
Great. Okay. Thank you for those questions. And Victor, thank you for the answers. And I'll turn it back over to Victor to continue with the presentation, and we'll take more questions through the chat and through your phone and computer at the next question period that Victor will bring up when he's ready. So I'll turn it over to Victor.
Great. Thank you, Eric. So now we're moving on to Manitoba. In 2003, Manitoba Hydro, the main utility in the province, they published the technical requirements for connecting distributed resources on the distribution system. This initiative made a distinction between generating systems with less than 200 kilowatts of capacity and systems with more than 200 kilowatts of capacity. The smaller systems are compensated through a net billing mechanism, and the other systems had to negotiate a power purchase agreement or a PPA contract with Manitoba Hydro. Then in 2016, the Solar Energy Pilot Program was launched, with the main distinctions being that customers under this pilot program are subject to a net metering mechanism as opposed to net billing. And also the program only included PV systems. Now, in terms of the results, there is no data available on the total installed capacity that has resulted from technical requirements for connecting distributed generation initiative. And in terms of the solar pilot program, the initiative resulted in 2.6 megawatts of installed solar capacity before it was canceled in May of 2018. The program received a lot of criticism due to the generous subsidies that were offered to participate in it. One of the biggest concerns was the potential impact of displacing an already dependable hydroelectric generation with intermittent generation, right? Because as maybe you all know, Manitoba has a lot of hydro resources, so they're concerned about the cost of displacing that hydro with other small-scale, less efficient types of generation. Lastly, the provincial government created a new agency called Efficiency Manitoba, which has been mandated to take over some energy-related initiatives. But so far, the agency has not announced the direction that it will take in terms of distributed generation. Now, moving on to Ontario. In 2006, the Ontario government introduced the Renewable Energy Standard Offer Program with the goal of promoting distributed generation between 1 kilowatt and 10 megawatts. Participants in this program were offered a 20-year fixed price contract to sell their output back to the province, and it was exclusive for systems connected into the distribution system. Now, building on this RESOP program, the government introduced the feed-in tariff program in 2009. This program expanded the scope to allow customers to connect small-scale generation into the transmission system and breaks down the program into 3 different categories. Large FIT for systems with a capacity greater than 500 kilowatts connected into the transmission or the distribution system. Small FIT category for systems between 10 kilowatts and 500 kilowatts. And the micro FIT systems with less than 10 kilowatts of capacity. All these categories were offered long-term fixed price contracts with an average duration of 20 years. And now that all depended on the fuel source and also the region where they were trying to connect those generators. Now, in terms of the results, the RESOP resulted in 825 megawatts of installed capacity. The large FIT program has right now 896 megawatts of contracted capacity. The small FIT program has 573. Now, both of these programs were canceled in 2016. And the micro FIT program currently has 261 megawatts of contracted capacity. And this program was canceled in 2017. Ontario was able to promote a wide diversity of generating technologies. And so not just solar or winds, but they were able to catch other sources. And going forward, the province is trying to set up regulation and make it more robust to accommodate other energy sources like batteries, storage, demand side, and energy efficiency equipment. Now, Quebec is, this is the easiest province. In 2016, the provincial government launched the net metering program, which included generating systems with less than 50 kilowatts of capacity. Other than that, the province has not mandated any other programs or policies. In terms of the results, there are really no reports on the progress of this program. But just to give you a little bit of context around the lack of appetite to promote distributed generation within Quebec, the province generates about 1/3 of the total Canadian generation. And of that is like 99.8% of the generation is already coming from renewable sources. Now, the province also has abundant access to other sources of electricity because it is well connected on the west with Ontario, to the New York ISO in the south, and to New Brunswick on the east, which allows the residents in the province to have one of the lowest electricity rates in the country. So, it's just my opinion, but I don't believe that right now the government is keen in promoting distributed generation at this point. So that's, let's do New Brunswick and then we take a little pause again. In 2015, the government introduced a program called Locally Owned Renewable Energy Projects that are small in scale, LORES for short. With this program, the provincial government directed New Brunswick Power, the main utility, to contract 80 megawatts of renewable energy through different sub-programs, which included the net metering program for systems with less than 100 kilowatts of capacity, the embedded generation program for systems between 100 kilowatts and 3 megawatts of capacity, with a total program cap of 20 megawatts, and a community energy program targeting First Nations communities, also with a program cap of 40 megawatts. Now, in terms of the results, the net metering program is still in place, but there are no reports on the subscription to this program. The embedded generation program is fully subscribed right now with 20 megawatts. And lastly, there is no information regarding the progress of the community energy program. So with that, why don't we take another break and see if people have any other questions or any comments?
Thanks, Victor. This is Eric again at Quest, everyone. Please enter your questions into the chat box, or you can definitely unmute yourself if you want to ask a question verbally. And we'll just pause for a minute and see if any questions come in verbally or through the chat box. And I do see a question that just came to me privately asking if we can share a copy of this presentation, and the answer is yes. And I see Victor nodding as well, so that's great. So yes, we will be sharing this. We're actually recording this webinar as well, and I'll be posting it on our Quest Distributed Energy Resources Working Group webpage, and so we'll have the presentation posted there as well, so you can see all those appendices that Victor had mentioned at the beginning. Okay, so we've got another question here through the chat. From your perspective, do you think that net program cancellation by governments has to do with revenue reduction or having overproduction at the current time? Do you think that they will reactivate these programs?
Well, that is a great question, and I think it's a little bit of both. With the net metering program, you know, it's a great way to incentivize people to connect microgeneration systems in their homes, because they can save a lot more of their personal cost. But the problem with the net metering program is that, or one of the challenges is that once people are paying less, then the rest of the people will have that don't have those access to those systems will have to pay more, right? It's not like once you connect the system that the cost just disappear. Like the cost, all the fixed costs, so all the transmission and distribution charges, they're going to remain there. But now there's going to be less people paying for that, right? So that is one of the concerns, that as less people, more people are able to avoid those paying for those costs, then the utility is at risk of losing some revenue. So the only way they can get back that revenue is by increasing the rates for the rest of the people, right? But then also it's a function of how much electricity you have already in place, which, you know, we see it in Manitoba Hydro, we see it with with Manitoba and with Quebec. They have so much capacity already installed, and all of it is already coming from renewable source. So and on top of that, you're also giving your customers, your residents, a low utility bill. So it's you know, it's hard to find the appetite politically, because you don't have any other you know, environmental reasons to try to switch to other sources. And also you know, your residents are already paying a low utility bill, so it's hard to sell. So I think it's, you know, it's, you don't also want to, you know, create a lot of cost for the rest of the people, but also if you already have abundant access to hydro resources, it's a tough sell.
That's great. And are there any other questions? You can enter them into the chat, Zoom chat, or you can unmute yourself in Zoom and ask it verbally. We'll just pause for a little bit of time to see if anything else comes in before moving on. Okay, so I think I'm not seeing any more in the chat. I'm not hearing any voices over the phone or computer. So I'll turn it back over to Victor to continue our walkthrough across the country as we get into Atlantic Canada here.
Yep. Thanks, Eric. And I hope people are still awake. So let's move on to Nova Scotia. In 2011, the government launched the Community Feed-in Tariff Program, or COMFET, which offered long-term fixed price contracts to participants, and originally included projects with generating capacity between 10 kilowatts and 5 megawatts. So that was kind of the official target, but if you look at the results, some of these projects ended up with an installed capacity between 6 and 7 megawatts. This program was in place between 2011 and 2016 before it was canceled. Then in 2016, the province launched a program called Solar for Community Buildings Pilot Project. This program promotes PV systems with less than 75 kilowatts of capacity. Participants were also offered a 20-year PPA contract with Nova Scotia Power, the utility in the province. Now, in the same year, the government also introduced the Enhanced Net Metering Program to promote the growth of distributed generation with less than 1 megawatt of capacity. This program didn't get a lot of traction, and in 2018, the government added another layer to the program and launched the Solar Homes Program, which offered rebates for those who wanted to install PV systems in their homes. Now, in terms of the results, the ComFit program brought 150 megawatts of renewable capacity to the province. Most of these projects were small wind projects, and the Solar Community Buildings Pilot Project brought 1.5 megawatts of solar capacity. The program is now closed. The Enhanced Net Metering Program was struggling at the beginning, as I mentioned, but once the government introduced the Solar Homes Program, there has been a bit more of interest, and it is estimated that if most of the projects that are completed, the small solar generation could reach up to 12.2 megawatts within the province. Now, PEI. In 2005, the province introduced the Renewable Energy Act, which mandated utilities to source at least 15% of their electricity sold to customers from renewable sources. Within this act, the net metering program was also introduced. And even though distributed generation was nothing new for the province, the net metering program offered the official regulatory framework to support the growth of these systems. This program included systems with a generating capacity of less than 100 kilowatts. In 2015, the Renewable Energy Act was amended because the share of renewable generation within the province went from 86% to 99%. So the government considered that this policy of sourcing at least 15% of the electricity from renewable sources was no longer necessary. Now, in terms of the results of these policies, there's no official reports on the net metering program. And in terms of the overall distributed generation policy, the province is pursuing other alternatives to address the high cost of electricity within the island. They're looking at energy efficiency programs, demand-side management programs, and also they are trying to focus to promote the growth of utility-scale solar projects. So anything that is connected onto the transmission system as opposed to the distribution system. And lastly, so Newfoundland and Labrador. In 2007, the government launched a provincial energy plan where the government committed to developing a regulatory framework to promote the growth of distributed generation. It was until 2015 when the government finally released their net metering policy framework to allow customers to install distributed generation systems with less than 100 kilowatts of capacity. But the province highlighted that the fact that this policy was to allow customers to offset their energy use rather than to promote small-scale renewable sources of electricity. The program has a cap of 5 megawatts. In the same year, the government introduced the Biogas Electricity Generation Pilot Project. This program included generating systems with less than 2 megawatts of capacity. The compensation structure in this program is based on a variable rate, which is equal to 90% of the avoided system marginal cost. This program also has a cap of 5 megawatts. Now, the results of these policies. The net metering program hasn't had a lot of success so far. The latest report indicates that there is a total of 419 kilowatts of installed capacity across the province. And Newfoundland and Labrador Hydro, one of the 2 utilities in the province, reports that they only have 1 customer under this rate structure. And for the biogas pilot project program, there are no official numbers available. Yeah, so with that, that's the end of the presentation. And I just want to give you a couple of quick announcements on some of our couple upcoming events. We are also having 2 webinars coming up. One on the role in Canada's crude, the role of rail in Canada's crude and petrochemicals market, and the electricity storage systems, applications and business cases. So with that, yeah, maybe I just open space again for more questions or comments or anything that you guys want to mention.
Thanks, Victor. Yes, and just to remind everyone, you can enter your questions into the chat box, or you can unmute yourselves in Zoom if you'd like to ask a question over the line. I have a couple of questions and comments in the chat that we'll get to first and see if anyone else wants to add theirs. So the first one is, how successful have these programs been across Canada to enable First Nation communities to go solar?
Well, so the official programs that we have seen in some of the provinces, and then that's what I was wondering, like, I don't know, I don't even know why sometimes they don't report on the progress. Some provinces are really good at reporting, so they have their official pilot project or whatever they have, and then usually there's like a report at the end of the year or 2 years to see how the policy is working. In some cases, it hasn't really worked, especially for distributed generation. Now, in terms of projects trying to connect, to targeting First Nations communities, but that connect their systems to the transmission system, I think there's been a little bit more success. Even in, I can just speak for what I know in Alberta. The NDP had a couple of programs that were targeting mostly First Nations communities to build grid scale projects, and I think that those were saw a lot of success, and then they were fully subscribed. Now some of these projects now are, or the programs are canceled. Yeah, and in terms of remote communities, I think that that's where there's still a lot of room for improvement, right? Like there is, we are working on a different study right now that is just going to expand on this topic. And what we're seeing is that there's some communities, especially northern Manitoba, northern Saskatchewan, and that are a little remote, that are still dependent on diesel generation, right? So there's still a lot of room for improvement.
Thanks, Victor. A lot of other questions coming in, so I can try to facilitate these here. Just a comment that in Nova Scotia, I know that you didn't make any reference to the tidal energy situation, and that's fine. And just someone was commenting that they're undergoing their integrated resource planning exercise now and trying to really push forward low carbon community options. Another question came through straight to me that I think is worth highlighting because it was also on my mind. I know there wasn't much talk in the presentation about virtual net metering, but would you be able to speak to that from your research experience? And then further to that, are you seeing anything around community-wide sub-metering, which can be considered an alternative to virtual net metering?
Yeah. So first of all, like no province has trying to implement these policies or this type of rate mechanism. So that's why I didn't touch on them. But I think in general, so say every time you have a system that is more than probably 4 or 5 megawatts, you already know that is going to be it's going to be serving obviously more than one house, so it's going to be serving more communities. Now I don't I don't quite know all the ins and outs of virtual metering, but I think the principle is the same, right? Like it's when you're trying to design these rates, you have to be very careful as to what are you trying to incentivize, and also who is going to be left behind with the total bill, right? Like if in the traditional utility model, maybe 20 years ago, you have these large centralized power plants that are really far away from the load centers, and they had to build, the province had to build all this infrastructure to bring the power into the communities. So all those costs are already there, right? And that's what we are, when you look at your bill, there's always going to be at least 3 different items. So it's your energy charge, your wire charges, and then some administration fees, right? So those wire charges are the ones that you don't want to, you want to be careful as to, whether you're going to be able to cover those costs. And also, one thing that I also want to point out is that those microgeneration systems are also expensive, and it's usually affluent families that can afford that kind of investment. So given kind of a little break to that group to offset some of their utility bills, and then letting the rest of the cost for everyone to pay, there's also some issues around there, right? So the rate design is crucial in this, as we're moving forward on this, with this, the growth of distributed generation. We need to make sure that you put the right incentives in place, but also that you're not leaving the bill for other people to pay.
Victor, another question here. Do you have any insights on future policy frameworks for distributed storage?
Well, so right now, if people want to learn a lot about this future or this policy framework, so you have to look at Ontario. Ontario is actually right now, they have the most installed capacity in terms of distributed generation in the grid. And also right now, so as I mentioned in the presentation, they canceled a couple of the programs, but it's not that they are trying to move away from it. They are just trying to make it robust enough, because they want to make sure that once you start getting into storage and other forms of trying to manage your local consumption, they want to make sure that, again, that they are still covering their costs, but also that they have the incentives to allow people to move ahead and install those systems, especially because the cost of these technologies are going down, right? So now they're becoming more competitive, and yeah, you want to keep an eye on Ontario's initiatives.
So a big question here, and you can do your best to try to tackle it. I'll just read the second half, because the first part is a preamble. So if governments are forced to extend their installed capacity through new facilities or contracts or net programs, which one do you think is more beneficial for both governments and society, as well as sustainable growth?
Yeah, can you repeat the question, please?
Sure, yeah. So, and the preamble has to do with governments kind of going more towards electrification and electric vehicles and heating and cooling with electricity. And so I'll read it back again here. If governments are forced to extend their installed capacity through new facilities or contracts or net programs, maybe net metering programs, which one do you think is more beneficial for both governments and society, as well as sustainable growth?
Well, I guess my first reaction will be that, it's not like you only have net metering as an option. So in Alberta and in other provinces, you have net billing, which is basically you have a two-way rate. So you have your rate that you pay if you didn't have those systems at home, and then you get a different rate when you're injecting electricity into the grid, and then at the end they do a net billing, right? So net metering is not the only way to incentivize the growth of these systems. You can also have there's other alternatives. So now in terms of what is most beneficial for I guess for the economy. So it will depend on your electricity mix that you have available at hand, right? So if you're looking at, say, Quebec, which is mostly hydro, trying to expand the capacity by allowing for net metering, you're actually, kind of like making it more expensive for everyone behind, right? But then if you are looking at, say, Alberta, which, we still have a lot of coal and natural gas. So maybe this, having a system that is going to displace that generation, and then it's going to increase the renewables from, at a small scale generation, like it might make more sense. But again, you still have to be careful as to how do you set up that incentive, and in my opinion, I think that net billing, is not perfect, but at least it does a good job at still treating people that are consuming electricity just the way that it was, like everyone else treated. Like you are all sharing the, you're paying for your share of the cost. But now, if you have a small scale generator and you are injecting electricity into the grid, then you also get compensated for that. So, yeah.
Thanks, Victor. Another question here around, are there any policies dealing with electric vehicles just charging back to the grid, so vehicle to grid? And what do you think about this in terms of future challenges?
Well, I mean, I guess if the question refers to connecting cars onto the transmission system, well, that just can't physically happen, because the voltage that you have on the transmission grid is too high to charge your vehicle. So you will always have to be one step removed and have like a substation that reduces the voltage, and then you are in the distribution system. But I think that that is something that BC and Ontario, again, they're trying to look into. That is like, how do you, if you have a charging station, like how would you be charging for that electricity, right? Because the electricity has to come from somewhere, and even though it's not, obviously it's not using gas or fossil fuels. So say in the case of Alberta, the electricity is also already coming from coal. So it's not like you're avoiding those. You're just turning on different emissions. But yeah, so in terms of trying to have a policy to accommodate for those new technologies, I think right now, yeah, again, Ontario is the one that is trying to adjust their rate structure to be able to open up the door for those systems, but also making them pay for the share of the cost.
And I can add to that, Victor, that I am aware of some vehicle to grid pilots that are going on where I know of one organization, Peak Power, is really doing a lot of work in the vehicle to grid space, as well as some utilities exploring, smart vehicle charging in workplaces and in multi-unit residential buildings to really work out how to balance when the vehicle is being charged and how to use it in a smart manner from the demand side, so that it doesn't place a large burden on the distribution grid. And just as we were going through that, a couple of new questions came in. How do you see the policy will change in future if the price of DERs or DCG reduce significantly?
Well, I guess, so the first thing is that, as the cost of these technologies start decreasing, then there's going to be less pressure for governments to try to come up with incentives or subsidies to try to promote the growth. And I think we're already seeing that with solar, like as these panels are getting to be more efficient and the cost is decreasing. Some of these subsidies are no longer required. So I think that the cost is just going to naturally allow the growth of these technologies. And but I think that that you also have to consider your, how much you are already paying for your bills, right? Like, because it is a big commitment, right? Like having those, even though the costs are going down, making those investments, sometimes they have you can recover your investment maybe in 20 years. So, is it worth, maybe it's it sounds like a good idea, but is it worth investing that much money when it will take you longer to recover those costs, right? So the cost of this technology has to decrease low enough that it makes it a solid business case. Yeah, Eric, can you hear me?
Oops, thank you, Victor. I was on mute. We're in our final couple of minutes, and we're just going to wrap up the webinar. Thank you, Victor, for alerting me to that. Thank you for the very interesting presentation. That gave a nice kind of cross-jurisdictional overview of the landscape across Canada. I think it was interesting for everyone to see at a high level what's happening in various provinces. And I guess from Quest's side of things, I do want to point out that beyond the provincial policies and programs that are out there, there are plenty of exciting things happening at the local level as well in terms of local energy solutions. So keep that in mind as well, that there's lots going on there. And thank you all for your questions today and for your engagement, and we really appreciated it. And we recorded today's webinar, so we'll be posting it on the Quest Distributed Energy Resources webpage early next week, along with the presentation itself, so you can take a look through it again. And with that, I'd like to thank Victor and thank everyone for joining us today, and wish you all a fantastic rest of your day and a fantastic weekend ahead. Thank you very much, everybody.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.